And then Dr. Rana, we look forward to your seminar.
Well, thanks, Gerald, for inviting me for this talk. I think I've watched videos and participated in these talks throughout my grad school. So this is really a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about QuantEXAFS, which is the code that I developed during my PhD work, and essentially focusing on well-defined materials such as atomically dispersed catalysts. This work was done in collaboration with Simon Baer and Amber Kulkarni's group at SLAC and UC Davis, respectively. And the idea essentially is to understand when these dynamic catalytic materials are performing under reaction conditions, how can we really understand precisely what the nature of our catalytic site is? And hopefully we can have an interesting discussion within the XAS and catalysis community as to how we can probe the nature of our catalytic sites. So with that, when we talk about catalytic materials, one of the most common thing that people are concerned about or are interested in understanding, and the field of catalysis focuses a lot on this, is the structure-function relationship. So catalytic materials are extremely sensitive to the temperature or the gas environment in which the precursors are treated, and they are constantly evolving. So what you see on the left here is an example where different gases and different temperatures can lead to different speciation of platinum from the same precursor on exactly the same support. So you can have large particles, small nanoparticles, isolated atoms of platinum. And this particle size distribution plays a very important role in the performance of these materials, which is why we call it structure-function relationship. And over the years, there has been a lot of development in the synthesis of these catalytic materials to really target a specific structure so that you can maximize the nature of the active sites over the spectators. Moreover, there is also an increased emphasis on efficient use of these precious metals, such as the platinum group metals, which are often used in these materials. So the field of catalysis essentially has evolved, where if there are large nanoparticles that perform better for a reaction, you really target and synthesize those materials, and there's a lot of shape and size selectivity involved there. But when you're trying to fundamentally probe a reaction or understand what's really happening and gain mechanistic understanding of material, the idea is then to just focus more on single atom catalysts or dispersed atoms or smaller clusters. So then, okay, when we talk about synthesis, we've synthesized a material, we get a specific structure based on the conditions we use in the synthesis. And based on that structure, we get properties of that catalytic material, whether it is activity, selectivity, or stability. But on the hindsight, there are a lot of questions that are always, exciting the catalysis community. For instance, when you do a specific synthesis that results in a specific structure, how is that structure formation taking place? When you go from that structure to a specific property, say activity or selectivity, how does that structure evolve under the reaction conditions? What are the dynamics of those catalytic sites, and which specific site is really contributing to the formation of the products that are required? And these are the questions which have really, interested the community. And over the years, we've used multiple characterization tools to understand the true dynamics of these catalytic sites and how do they evolve under reaction conditions. But one of the questions that stayed in the community for a very long time that still is a challenge for us to answer is, how do we get quantitative distribution of these sites in the material? Because there could be one metal that's responsible, but what specific site is still a question. And the reason we care about it is because we want to make things simple, but not simpler than what they actually are. So with that, when we talk about the catalysis community, we can literally box them into two different communities. The first one is the experimental catalysis community that does all the reactions in the lab, and then you have different characterizations that they utilize, for instance, spectroscopy, microscopy to get the images of these materials. And then there is computational catalysis community, which is more focused on understanding the mechanism of different reactions, formation energies of catalytic materials, thermodynamic properties of those sites. But then the question is, ever since we've been trying to understand, using multiple tools, how these catalytic sites evolve, is there a way to not just collaborate with theory and not just establish a collaboration between experimental catalysis community and computational catalysis community, but somehow integrate them in a way where we can really be assisted in understanding the true nature of our catalytic materials? And that was something that really motivated us to, think during my PhD work when we were thinking about how do we develop a tool that could assist in something like this. So in a broader perspective, when we talk specifically about spectroscopic methods, there have been tremendous advancements in the way we now go to a beamline, or the spectrometers have evolved massively over the past years. For example, there is benchtop XAS nowadays. But then the way we analyze the material cannot be one size fits all. There are different variety of catalytic materials, and you really have to think about the problem that you're targeting and what would be the best way to analyze it, because all of that effort of going to a beamline or setting up an experiment is really becomes less efficient if you do not have the right tool to analyze the material. The other thing that I want to bring your attention to is the word well-defined. So when we particularly talk about atomically dispersed catalyst, almost in every manuscript, we come across this word called well-defined. But I want to emphasize here that until and unless you have a very stable support that's not really moving under reaction conditions, and you have dispersed atoms of a specific metal, it is really important to go after and understand what that specific site is and how homogeneous it is, or if it is heterogeneous, to address that in the work, rather than just unanimously defining everything that is atomically dispersed as well-defined, because it truly is not well-defined in that case. And so ultimately, to answer these questions and to solve this, there's really important to investigate these sites and these catalytic materials in details and invent new tools that can somehow integrate experiments and theory in a way that instead of working like, as two different communities, we can have an integrated approach to design a problem and solve it so that we can really get to the depth of it. So with that, I want to point out to some of the bigger challenges that specifically the atomically dispersed catalysts face. So one of the key results that you would see when you use extra absorption spectroscopy in atomically dispersed catalytic materials is this, what you see in black here, where you have the absence of metal-metal bond or scattering path is indicative of having an atomically dispersed catalyst. It could be an elimination method, but to use it as a validation for having an atomically dispersed site has been questionable. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown that not just having the absence of that metal-metal interaction does not really confirm that you have an atomically dispersed site. And what I want to quote here is this very interesting work from the Korma group, where they said characterization techniques carried out in an inadequate way can introduce confusion in the interpretation of coordination environment of highly dispersed platinum species. This was a specific study that they conducted where they used different sizes of platinum catalyst for different reactions. But then one of the key points that they were focusing on was this relevance of how you are interpreting the results of the characterization technique that you're using. So that was very important to account for. And then there was another work that also accounted for these discrepancies of or challenges when you have atomically dispersed platinum versus a metal oxide cluster, and how would you differentiate between the two? And this was the work that was done by Phil Christopher's group and Simon Baer's group in collaboration, where they showed that it is really challenging to sometimes differentiate between the two. So just having the absence of that metal-metal bond does not really validate that you have an atomically dispersed site in your material. Specifically, when you're talking about, understanding reaction mechanisms, calculating your energy barriers using these structures that you interpret from your EXAFS results, it really becomes challenging because there's question about site heterogeneities, there's question about anisotropic effects and particle size effects. And so there has to be a more consolidated way of understanding these materials and to overcome those caveats, especially when you're talking about well-defined materials that are not as complex to model. So this was the science aspect of how the atomically dispersed catalyst community faces some of the pitfalls. But then in addition to that, there's also a motivation. There has been a lot of talks about X-ray large, which is a great tool, which also is used in QuantEXAFS. In fact, we've been using GUI, and this graphical user interface has been so much a part of the EXAFS community and the catalysis community in general over the past years that it's just knowledge passed from one generation of graduate students to the other. But now, because it's become like you have hundreds of data sets that are generated every hour when you go to a beamline and you do fast scans or you do quick XAS, you have to deal with all of that data set. And moreover, how many paths, how many models are you going to give to your fit? So there's always this human bias where you start with, you hypothesize a particular model, and then you try to fit that model to your EXAFS data. So we have to think about, when we talk about well-defined catalytic materials, we really have to think about how we can eliminate these kind of human biases and also deal with that large set of data set that's generated. So it's really important to automate the process of EXAFS fitting, A, and B, to somehow decrease or reduce that human bias from your fitting approach. And then there is the science aspect. When it comes to atomically dispersed literature, and when you claim that your catalyst is well defined, having a quantitative matrix to define how do you qualify a fit to be a good fit? How do you claim that your site is homogeneous and it matches with the experimental EXAFS data has been a big question in the community. And you have heterogeneous sites. You want to understand whether there's sintering, whether you have minority species that are responsible for catalytic activity in your reaction. All these questions always remain somehow unanswered if you do not understand the nature of your site. And so what you see here on the left is an EXAFS fit, which the authors claimed to have understood the nature of their catalytic site. As you can see here, they pointed out to a specific structure. But interestingly, the coordination numbers for platinum and oxygen and platinum with magnesium, there were 3 different coordination numbers predicted. But then if you think of it in the 3D space, there are numerous structures that you could construct out of it just by these coordination numbers. So we really do not have a well-defined system then in that case. And so these were the questions that we've had over the past and that have intrigued us. And so then the question was, when you talk about somehow integrating experiments and theory and leveraging the coding platform that X-ray Large gives you, and understanding these materials on a very well-defined system, it is important to somehow think of beyond the conventional EXAFS analysis and beyond targeting these average structural information and thinking of some advanced tools that you can use for a specific material that you have targeted to get some accurate structural identification of the material. And so in my talk today, we're going to talk about 2 such tools that we've thought about and developed over the past couple of years during my PhD work. The first one is called QuantEXAFS. If you have a well-defined material that you really think is very homogeneous, it is important for you to either understand what that material is or acknowledge that it's not as homogeneous as it is thought to be. And so QuantEXAFS is a tool that really helps you in identifying that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and give you some examples of how we used QuantEXAFS in different materials. And then ultimately, in the real world application, even if you're working with atomically dispersed catalysts, not everything is as homogeneous as we want it to be. And so how do we tackle site heterogeneities? And that's the question you answer using MS-QuantEXAFS or multi-site QuantEXAFS code. So with that, talking about QuantEXAFS, with beamline scientists working across the globe that, they try to make some amazing beamlines. There are also a lot of catalysis-focused beamlines that are being made now. So for instance, a shout out to Adam Hoffman at SSRL and his team, who've made this in situ and operando capabilities possible for specifically catalytic systems to directly probe the nature of the active side of the catalyst. But the challenge is, how are we going to utilize that data to understand the nature of our site, and how are we going to deal with the large volumes of data sets that are generated in the beamlines? And so QuantEXAFS is a tool that is a quantitative tool where you're taking it's quantitative analysis of X-ray absorption spectroscopy data using quantum chemistry tools such as density functional theory. So the two inputs that you need in the code are data from the beamline and a structure, an exhaustive structure of optimized DFT structures in the database. So the idea is QuantEXAFS uses X-ray large, FEF, and X-ray lib in the backend. And the idea is when you have experimental EXAFS data and you have an exhaustive database of these DFT optimized structures, you can generate model for each of those structures using these, using QuantEXAFS, and then QuantEXAFS does a one-to-one mapping of your experimental EXAFS data with the model from the structure. So you're not really fitting coordination numbers and bond distances in this case. You have a site and you're just trying to, put that piece into the puzzle and see if that fits. And that's how QuantEXAFS works in the backend. So to simplify this, when it comes to the ease of using something like QuantEXAFS, if you have, say, 10 spectra from the beamline and you use conventional analysis tools, you're really limited by the number of models you would have if you're not using computational tools such as density functional theory. And then you also have to be very selective about the paths that you can use. And it takes you weeks and months to get that information about the average coordination environment of your material. And this works great if you have a very complex material. But if you have a well-defined system, nothing is stopping us from optimizing those structures, even if there are hundreds or 500s of structures. And then with QuantEXAFS, you can use like within minutes or hours in a completely automated fashion, you can get a precise identification of your catalytic site. So I'll take a pause here and happy to take questions.
I'll just ask one question. If you go back one slide. So I totally understand the use of the hundreds of DFT optimized structures and whatnot. But one of the pieces you'll do next is use your theory code to get what the spectrum should be. What are the concerns about lack of linear independence between the spectra for different local coordinations?
We're not really fitting any coordination there. So there is barely any. So as long as it's a homogeneous site, it really fits well to the specific structure, provided you account for all the defects and all the adsorbates that could possibly be present in the system.
Okay. All right. Not seeing any other questions. You should continue.
Okay. So once we had the QuantEXAFS code developed, it was very obvious for us to collaborate with Professor Bruce Gates at UC Davis and Coleman Kronawitter at UC Davis because they work with atomically dispersed catalysts to start testing the code. The idea was they make this beautiful homogeneous catalytic material of platinum on magnesium oxide or different transition metals on magnesium oxide. However, they were always limited with the coordination number that they were able to predict using the conventional tools. So with that, I would just give you a quick run through of how the workflow for platinum on magnesium oxide, which was the very first system we worked on during the PhD work that I did was. So the first thing was once the material was synthesized, this was done by Bruce Gates's postdoc then. The idea was to characterize this to see how homogeneous the material was, and we did high resolution microscopy at Oak Ridge to get these images. And then once we had confirmed that this is a very homogeneous platinum on magnesium oxide system, there were no metallic clusters or anything. We wanted to then start doing density functional theory calculations. So we used enumeration method where we accounted for all the platinum positions that we could plausibly think of that could be present in our system. We accounted for defects within the system and also adsorbates. And then we also tried to account for both the terrace sites and the step sites. The next step was to see how thermodynamically stable the material was. So we calculated the phase diagrams for all the facets that we had within the database to understand which would be the most stable structures. And then we used QuantEXAFS to run through and see how the fit would work. So the idea or the conceptual layout of how the fitting approach is different in QuantEXAFS is, you really want to account for not just the single scattering path, but also the multiple scattering paths. So the idea is if you have a DFT structure and you start generating the model of it. So once the scattering paths are generated, you take all those paths without any elimination, and then you have this parameterization scheme, which enables you to use all the paths and then model an EXAFS spectrum based on the structure that you have. And then the structure does one-to-one mapping. Now, the idea was if we have like 50 or 500 structures, there has to be a way to look at all the data set altogether. Otherwise, it would be very time consuming. So then we thought of plotting a reduced chi-square versus for each structure. So what you see here is the bar is going to be the value of the reduced chi-square for each structure in the database. But then we also wanted to see physically what the EXAFS fit looks like. And so for that, we thought of including a delta Frichet, which is a statistical matrix for the similarity between two curves. So we were really comparing how similar the curve that came out of the model was to the experimental EXAFS fit. And so, for instance, for this platinum on magnesium oxide system that was extremely homogeneous, we had about 50 DFT optimized structures in the database. And what you see here is the lower the value of reduced chi and delta Frichet, the better the fit is in terms of EXAFS. And so these terrace sites with magnesium vacancy, which was very counterintuitive in the beginning to us, were some of the best fit structures. What you see on the right is another powerful way of combining experiments and theory, where you have the goodness of fit parameters for EXAFS on the Y1 and Y2 axis, but you have the Boltzmann fraction, which suggests how well a material can be present in a specific energy state on the x-axis. And so for each of these facets that we had in the database, I've pointed out the three most stable structures. Now, if we just look at these two plots, what we can see is that we know that the 100 mg vacancy should be the best EXAFS fit. So let's see what the structures look like first. So the first one was a surface platinum that was bound to two oxygen species. The second one was a subsurface platinum that was embedded inside the magnesium oxide lattice and was adjacent to a magnesium vacancy. And then the third one was a step site. And indeed, the 100 mg vacancy structure gave us the best EXAFS fit, as you can see here on the slide. Moreover, we were now able to have, instead of having those average coordination numbers that we always struggled with, particularly for these atomically dispersed sites, we were able to map what were the nearest neighbors to our platinum atom. And that really helped us in further calculating barriers and other things that I will show you shortly. So then this was one thing. So from EXAFS, using QuantEXAFS, we had an answer to our puzzle as to this probably is the structure that our catalytic site could best match. And then because we had done other spectroscopic measurements on this material, we went to SLAC to do HERFD experiments, and we collaborated with Fernando. So I gave him the structure that we figured from QuantEXAFS, and he helped us do simulations of these, the structure. And indeed, the structure that we found from QuantEXAFS that gave us the best EXAFS fit was the one that gave us the most reasonable fit for HERFD as well. In addition to that, we were also able to calculate binding energies of CO because we did some infrared absorption spectroscopy measurements in the lab, and we found that this subsurface platinum was not binding CO. And what we see here is from these plot, we all, like at room temperature, all the CO is above 0.0 charge energy. And so it's not going to bind CO. And we know that from both this result. And the reason we were able to calculate this is because we had all the structures in the database and we could compare them. And ultimately, because we had an initial structure that we hypothesized was probably the representation of our catalytic site, we were able to calculate the barriers for a probe reaction. In this case, it was CO oxidation reaction that we performed, and the results were in fairly decent agreement. So without getting into the details, the idea here is once you're able to identify the structure, there's nothing stopping us to use that structure and validate it with multiple experimental techniques to answer the question that we're really interested in. This is another example of a platinum and magnesium, again, system where we had a completely different site. This was a surface site of platinum, and we used QuantEXAFS to get the structure. And then based on that, because we were using, we had a specific structure that we could utilize here, we could compare the infrared absorption CO drifts experimental results, what you see here, to computationally calculated vibrational frequencies, and they were in agreement as compared to the experimental results. So this idea of using a well-defined material and calculating, like doing experiments on those materials and then validating that using some computational tool or techniques is something that can really help you build on the story and understand how your catalytic site is evolving under reaction conditions. And with the help of this work, we were able to identify two different and very unique sites of platinum on magnesium oxide. Magnesium oxide is known to be very stable support. But in case of platinum, what we found was given a specific calcination treatment, you would result in different sites of platinum on and in the magnesium lattice. The other important thing that I want to highlight here is when we talk about the conventional EXAFS fitting for atomically dispersed catalysts in particular, or well-defined materials, if we are just restricted to the coordination numbers, we can have multiple structures that can come out of it. And this is just one example that I'm showing you here. So if you see here, these are two different structures which have the same coordination for magnesium and oxygen to the platinum atom here, but their spatial orientations are different. And because we are doing this one-to-one mapping of the experimental data with the data from the DFT database, we're able to get spatial orientation of those atoms that are neighboring to our central atom. And that's how we're able to get or capture anisotropic effects in our material. And that's really important when you're talking about these dispersed atoms that are catalytically active. So with that, I'll take another break and happy to take questions.
Thanks. I'm going to read one of the questions from the chat. How do you determine that the 100 DFT models generated are sufficient to exhaust all relevant structural possibilities?
So that's a great question. I would say it really starts from how homogeneous the site is. If you have, if you see that multiple characterization techniques lead you to the same site, and because we're not really fitting coordination numbers or bond distances in this case, you would not have a perfect fit with your EXAFS data if there are site heterogeneities. And so the idea is to go by the chemical intuition and then use any computational method, say enumeration or whatever you think is deemed best. I will also talk about zeolites in my next slide, where we used an automated code called Maze that would generate 500 or 600 structures. So it really, the question is to understand the chemistry of your material and understand how complex it is. And based on that, if you think there could be defects, account for those. If you think there could be adsorbates, account for those. So it's really getting into the details. I think that's the key to get a successful result from QuantEXAFS. You really have to have a very exhaustive database.
Okay. And then there's a second question. How do you evaluate the accuracy of your DFT models? Asking about what benchmarks or other validations you rely on.
So for the first case, when we were doing, it really depends upon what material you're talking about. But then, for instance, when I was doing optimizations for these platinum and magnesium oxide systems, we use different functionals, and all the functionals gave us the same optimizations. So really, there's not much need to benchmark it unless you have some, Hubbard correction or related things that you would need to account for. It really depends upon what structure you're specifically targeting. And there's a lot of information that is available in the literature when you start talking about optimizations, and you can account for those.
All right, not seeing other questions. You should continue. Oh, wait, hang on. There's a new message. Nope. All right, go ahead. We're good. You should continue, please.
Okay. So with that, the other, like I was mentioning when the previous question was asked, We wanted to also understand if we go beyond just atomically dispersed catalysts that are stabilized on magnesium oxide or any kind of a very well behaved, let's say, metal oxide support, would we be able to use QuantEXAFS to understand the nature of the catalytic side? And so there was this beautiful study that was being conducted in Professor Coleman Cronowitter's group led by Noah, his PhD student then, where they were trying to understand the speciation of platinum, where it would have, it would redisperse under oxidative conditions. And then when you reduce it, it would become a platinum cluster. And when it redispersed, the platinum would get into the pores of the material. And this was characterized using COIR, infrared spectroscopy. You would see two carbon monoxide ligands being formed with the platinum atom that was in the pore. And so then the idea was, okay, we're doing this. We went to the beamline, we collected the data, and we knew that, if you look at the curves on the extreme right, figure C, we calcined material looked very similar to the redispersed material, and the reduced material signified metallic platinum. Well, the question was, how do we understand where is this platinum, bonded in the zeolite? And so for that, we started using QuantEXAFS. And in this case, we went beyond, 50 structures because this was a very complex system as compared to the previous one. So we used this code called Maze, which is, from Umber's group. There were another set of students who generated this code for automated generation of different sites and zeolites. And so there were about 300 structures that were, stable. And then out of those, there were about 118 structures that gave us a decent fit. But then the idea was to plot the relative energies determined from DFT against the zeolite framework for the aluminum distance, because that was the key thing based on the IR results that we had. So here we're not really relying on just EXAFS or just DFT. It's like a combination of infrared spectroscopy, X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and density functional theory. So once we had this, we started using QuantEXAFS on all the structures. It was just a completely automated way. The code would fit all the structures and all the data sets that were present in the database. And then what we found was that this was a platinum coordinated with 4 oxygen atoms and 2 neighboring aluminum atoms in a 6-membered ring. And what was interesting is this was not the most stable structure. So if we were going by DFT intuition, we would have thought that, there's another structure that's more stable and that's going to be our best fit. But that most stable structure did not give us the best EXAFS fit. So the combination of the most stable structure and a decent EXAFS fit was the one that you see here, which was the second most stable structure in the database. And so it's really going by, your EXAFS fit, what it's telling you, and at the same time combining this relative energy of your structures in the database to identify what could be the potential site that you're looking at in the system. And then this material was used for, see oxidative studies and other things in future. But I just wanted to highlight that, it's not just a specific system that you have to use. As long as you can rely on the DFT and the, other characterization tools such as infrared spectroscopy, you can really answer questions using QuantEXAFS for a well-defined material. So with that, we collaborated with multiple teams, both internally at UC Davis and outside. We tried studying different materials such as beta zeolites, different transition metals stabilized on magnesium oxide for CO oxidation or hydrogenation reactions. And then we also studied some HZSM5 that had moly as the active site in it. So these were multiple studies that were conducted using QuantEXAFS. So, okay, we talked about QuantEXAFS. It worked decently well for homogeneous structures, but then we were still kind of stuck in the loop because we started the problem with how do we quantify different sites that are present in our catalytic material? And that's the big question there. And so if it's a homogeneous system, QuantEXAFS works great. But then if there was site heterogeneities, we started running into problems because we would not get the best fit. And so that's where we started thinking about how could we leverage, what we had found in QuantEXAFS to take it a step further and try to quantify site heterogeneities in the system. And so for those of us who really do not do a lot of catalysis, I just want to highlight that, these site heterogeneities are really important because it's not just, you can have like EXAFS in itself is a bulk technique. So you're really looking at, the majority of sites that you have. But if you can get to this, like the benefit of using these atomically dispersed catalysts is like you can really get to the, minority of species that could be present. And those minority of species can be very important because they could be the active sites and your bulk species could just be spectators in a catalytic reaction. So you really want to understand what is it that's, leading to your active sites. If there is deactivation happening, or if you're really interested in understanding the stability of your catalytic site, it's really important to, again, account for these site distributions. If you have site reactions and you want to understand what specific site is leading to that, again, the question is, how do you account for these site heterogeneities? So for these numerous questions, it was extremely important for us to probe the heterogeneity of these catalytic sites in well-defined systems. So for that, we started thinking about how could we design this concept of using QuantEXAFS to then further understand the presence of multi-sites. And so we called it multi-sites or MS-QuantEXAFS. And the way the workflow works is essentially you run a QuantEXAFS fit on the data, and what you get is, you'll not get a specific structure giving you the best fit, but you will get a set of structures that are extremely stable and also give you a decent EXAFS fit. Now, what you do is the code takes different combinations of these structures. The limitation is 3. If you go beyond 3, it's not going to work. But so if you have 2 to 3 different species present, the code is going to take combination of these structures, and then it generates all the scattering paths that you can, you'll have from those structures, and it feeds them to this MS-QuantEXAFS workflow. And turns out, instead of getting just the thermodynamically most stable structure that's representative of the majority of the sites, what you get is fractional contribution of those different sites. So if there's site 1 and site 2 in this case that I'm representing here in orange, what MS-QuantEXAFS is going to tell you is a ballpark value of how much of site 1 is present versus how much of site 2 is present in your based on your EXAFS data that you have. All right, so when it comes to the code, once the code was developed, we've since the very beginning, we've been talking about how to integrate experiments and theory. So the idea was we have the code, we have to benchmark it really carefully. And so our subsurface platinum on magnesium oxide system was one of the most stable and homogeneous system for us to benchmark this code. And then in addition to that, we needed another species of platinum that we could have. And for that, we collaborated with Professor Matteo Carnello at Stanford. His group makes this beautiful homogeneously sized nanoparticles using colloidal synthesis method. So we had these isolated platinum and then these nanoparticles of platinum both supported on magnesium oxide. And then we made a physical mixture of these two samples in different fractions. So what we did is we had known fractions of each of these, and we went to the beamline and we collected our X-ray absorption spectroscopy data at cryogenic temperatures. And then the idea was to see whether MS-QuantEXAFS would be able to predict what fraction of a specific structure is present in the experimental EXAFS data in this benchmarking system. So the first one, what you see is a pure nanoparticle of platinum on magnesium oxides. There was no isolated platinum. And what you see in red here is the experimental fraction of nanoparticle that was mixed in the sample. And what you see in green is the predicted value of that fractional contribution of that structure using MS-QuantEXAFS. And so if you see for all of these, we went, we did different reproducibility tests, and what we found was that this was in fairly decent agreement as to what was the targeted fraction of these nanoparticles versus atomically dispersed platinum in each of these systems. So once the code was developed, the next question was, can we use this for a more realistic system? So I was working with Chen, one of the postdocs in Professor Gates's lab. We were doing some beamline experiments there at SLAC. And the idea was we were doing palladium on magnesium oxide, and we were trying to understand how calcination treatment was impacting the dispersion or fragmentation of palladium, and more importantly, how was this palladium site behaving for ethylene hydrogenation reaction? So we had this. We had two different calcination temperatures. One was 500, and the other was 700. This was in situ at the beamline, and so the 700 site was homogeneous, but the 500 site was not. We really did not get a decent fit for the 500 site, or the site that was calcined at 500. Using any of the structures in our database. And we had like accounted for almost all the structures that we could physically think of in this. And then the idea was, can we use MS-QuantEXAFS to pick a few of the best or the decent fit structures using that we got from QuantEXAFS, and then have the stable structures from the DFT optimized database to see if MS-QuantEXAFS could answer the question and help us solve this puzzle. So we found that we went from palladium surface site that was going subsurface, and at 500, some of those sites were already subsurface, which is why we had a fractional contribution of both the surface site and the subsurface site of palladium that resulted in a much better EXAFS fit using MS-QuantEXAFS. So we were able to fractionally resolve this and then validate this further by using the data from our TFT calculations, where we found that because the 700 site was much homogeneous, the apparent activation energy of the reaction matched beautifully with the calculated barriers from DFT, whereas because there was heterogeneity in our 500 site, the barrier that was calculated was much lower using DFT as compared to the actual apparent activation barrier for the ethylene hydrogenation reaction for this catalyst, because we were accounting for just the surface site, which was much more active as compared to the subsurface site. So for this, we were able to understand, I mean, there was other details in this, but in the interest of time, I would just, try to complete the story where we went from with different treatments of palladium particle on magnesium oxide resulted in metallic palladium, and then it went to palladium nanoparticles of palladium oxide, and then a surface palladium site, and ultimately a subsurface, much homogeneous palladium site. So with that, then we went to, using this MS-QuantEXAFS and some other materials. But then the key thing here is, or the key takeaway from this is like a message to the community in general is, when you use advanced methods and when you use precise synthesis, it is really important to at least seek more accurate identification of your atomically dispersed sites. I hope I was also able to demonstrate today that QuantEXAFS is a completely automated tool that is robust and can be transferred to materials that are well-defined and that can be simulated using DFT calculations. And then MS-QuantEXAFS can help us quantify site heterogeneities in catalytic materials that are, again, well-defined and are not extremely homogeneous or are like big nanoparticles. So the idea is to think of tools beyond QuantEXAFS and MS-QuantEXAFS that we can develop as together as a community to solve this problem of, instead of just having average sites, to get understanding of, accurate site distribution in materials. And then ultimately, I want to thank all my PIs, my current PI, Yuri, my PhD advisors. This work was a part of my PhD work. So Amber and Simon and all my collaborators, Bruce, Coleman, and Matteo were very instrumental in this. The institutes I have worked with, the funding agencies. And lastly, I just want to say that in this journey of being an academic and a scientist or researcher, I really enjoy working in bridging the gap between the experiments and theory. And so I hope I continue to do that, continue to understand and use these well-defined catalytic materials to identify and gain fundamental insights into reaction kinetics, and ultimately use operando tools to understand new catalytic materials so that we can probe those catalytic sites. And with that, I am looking forward to joining Louisiana State University as an assistant professor next year. And then they have a second generation synchrotron, and there are a lot of exciting stuff that they're planning to do. And this is EXAFS community. So I really look forward to learning from you all and collaborating with you all. And yeah, happy to take any questions. Thank you all for your time.
All right, we do indeed have some questions. Let's start. William, would you like to open up your mic and ask your question?
Sure, yes. First, thank you for the wonderful talk. I love seeing these increased levels of automations to improve the checks between the experiments and the theory. Quick question, since the DFT database of structures is needed as an input for the QuantEXAFS package, do you have a different tool chain that you use to generate that database? Is that manual or is that largely automated?
It's both. So it started with manual, but then we started doing, so as long as we give a SMILES script and we do enumeration method to just get all the structures in the database. And for zeolites, we use maze code. And that just automatically gives the database.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, Hailey, you have a question?
Yes, great talk. So I have a question. Do you have a threshold for what you consider an acceptable energy difference from the lowest energy structure? Because sometimes the target structure may not be included in the candidate database. And how do you differentiate or do you decide whether it's better to check those less stable structures or to put more, add some new structures in your database? And also, what is considered, because you need to quantify the similarity between the simulated data with the experimental data, right? And how do you consider a good similarity score?
Okay. So I'll start with the last one first because I just remember that question first. So the similarities essentially it's completely we don't try to include any human bias there. So if there is not a good delta Fréchet value that you get and reduced chi or R factor value. So this has to be a combination of that, and the Boltzmann fractions should be like, you have to account for all three matrices there. If you don't get anything, then we go back to our database and we see if we have missed some potential structures that could be present. So that's that's completely like, there's no negotiation there. So if you do not get a good fit, or if you do not have a stable structure that's giving you a good fit, we really have to rethink if we missed a structure that could potentially be a strong candidate there. And then your first question was,
what is the acceptable energy difference from the lowest energy structure?
It really depends upon how complex the system is, but we usually do not really. So as long as we're able to get our initial database, we're more interested in, or at least in the past studies, I mean, that's something I should actually think about. I've not really done that. But we've mostly been more interested in, did we miss an adsorbate? Did we miss a specific vacancy or something? That's the major challenge that we've faced in the past, more than, stability of the structures, because most of the structures are fairly stable and you get a wide range of variety of structures that are within the range. And then once you have those structures, it is the EXAFS fit that makes the key difference between, structures that lie within the same stability pool.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, another question from Itzhak.
Yes, hi. Thanks for very nice talk. One question, you focused really on EXAFS analysis. Could XANS be, let's say, a complementary and useful tool to help identifying sites or to decide, because in principle, with principal component analysis, you can at least determine how many could be there, or is it not sensitive enough?
No, I think this is a great question. And if you see our manuscripts, they do have Zanes and PCA or MCR ALS, for instance. But then the idea here was to, put QuantEXAFS there and be like, so there is like, I just think of QuantEXAFS or MCR ALS, or there are many tools that are there. The thing is, there's also a lot of work that's done by Yanis Timoshenko and Anatoly on machine learning, for instance. The idea is, what is the tool that fits best to your catalytic system or whatever system you're working on, and how is it helping you to answer the question? So absolutely, you can use those tools, and they are also really valuable. But then the question is, what fits best to your system, I would say. So yeah, Zanes are definitely useful, and it could also answer the questions, and we've used them.
Okay, I think we've run through the questions. We should all thank Dr. Rana again, and I'll stop the recording, and we have a little bit of time for informal discussion. Thank you. This is a terrific talk.
Thank you all for your attention.